I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Wayne Phelps, a retired Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel and author of On Killing Remotely, The Psychology of Killing with Drones. During his military career, Wayne deployed 5 times, including 2 deployments to Afghanistan and 2 deployments to Iraq. He was amongst the first conventional troops on the ground in Pakistan after 9/11. He also participated in the initial invasion into Iraq in 2003 and the troop surge into Afghanistan in 2010. He's commanded units at every level from platoon to squadron, served as an instructor at the Marine Corps Premier Aviation Training Squadron, and a staff officer in the Pentagon. In 2014, he was selected to become an RPA pilot, and he attended the Air Force's undergraduate pilot training to become the first Marine honor graduate. His last assignment was as the commanding officer of the Marine Unmanned Aerial Vehicle Squadron 3 in Hawaii. As the commanding officer, he deployed 4 remotely piloted aircraft detachments to conduct counter-terrorism operations against violent extremist organizations. Wayne joins us today to discuss the nature of remote killing and the future of automation in this new world of warfare. So Wayne, welcome, sir. And let me start by thanking you very sincerely. Thank you for your career of service. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Really appreciate that.
Oh, absolutely. It is an honor to have you here. My brother is a combat veteran as well. So I understand, I guess, better than many, with some of the things you've been through. On Killing Remotely touches a lot of really big moral and ethical issues that have never been fully explored or resolved. So let me ask, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, Tim, as you discussed, my last tour of duty, I was the squadron commander for a drone squadron based in Hawaii, and we spent 24 months out of the 26 months I was in command actually fighting against a violent extremist organization overseas. And I got to the end of my career, and I had always had aspirations of writing a book. So I said, well, what would I write about? And, most people write about what they know. And I said, well, I have a pretty decent understanding of drones. But what I think there is a lack of information on is how it affects people, that are conducting those kinds of operations. And the more I researched it, the more I realized that there wasn't a ton of literature on it. There wasn't a bunch of studies on it. So I actually had reached out to Dave Grossman, who's the author of On Killing and On Combat, and I asked him if he would be interested in collaborating with me on a book called On Killing Remotely, where we looked at basically the same things that he did on killing, the psychological challenges and physiological challenges of the human response to killing and combat, except looking at it through the lens of drone operators. And he said, yeah, I think that's a fantastic idea. Let's do it. He said, as long as you're on board with doing 90% of the work, then I'll definitely be interested in doing that. And I said, okay, that's perfect. So that set me down a path of actually having to do the research and do the actual writing, which took me a couple of years to complete.
Well, and so I definitely want to touch on the psychology part of that in a moment. But one of the things that I wanted to start with, and I think this is for me, I think this is an intensely interesting subject because warfare is changing, right? As technology continues to increase, and warfare is going to continue to change. It's becoming more automated. It's becoming more remote. And so you are on the cutting edge of the future of warfare, but a lot of the issues that are involved with it, and I'm not making any value judgments. We've never really looked at these, right? And so, like, as a society, we've never really had a hard discussion or made firm decisions about remote killing. The impression that I had was back in the beginning, we had the MQ-1 Predator drone, and that was a surveillance drone, right? And at some point, due to battlefield expediency, basically someone put a Hellfire missile on it, and it ended up becoming the MQ-9 Reaper. and it kind of became the standard. But it wasn't something where they ever looked at it and said, okay, well, this is, we're going to make this permanent change, right? It seemed like it was more of a short-term solution that just kind of became law, so to speak. So I think what you're exploring is incredibly valuable, you know. So what were, if it's okay to ask, what were some of the psychological aspects of this that you talk about in the book?
Yeah, so what I determined, and really I did a survey of 254 people that had used a drone to kill somebody in conflict, and then I conducted over 50 first-person interviews of similar people. What I wanted to understand was, how do we kill with a drone? How do we respond to that, and then why do we respond that way? And what I found was that there's a spectrum of responses, ranging from positive responses all the way down to negative responses. And the positive responses are not, they're not like people that are happy that they're doing, that they're killing somebody in conflict, but they're proud of the work that they're doing, that they're accomplishing a mission, that they're saving people's lives, things like that. In the middle was kind of neutral responses, which were, really neither positive nor negative, feelings of ambivalence. And then on the smaller end of the spectrum were these negative responses, where people were experiencing things like trouble with sleeping, or recurrent waking memories of things that they had seen or done. Really a whole bunch of things that are precursors to post-traumatic stress. So there was a small percentage of folks that actually had experienced those, and they had some negative responses, whether they're either short-term or long-term, that turned into post-traumatic stress.
Now, with these people, with the surveys that you did, were you able to identify any personality traits that might apply to future operators, right? And what I'm wondering is, like, obviously you would want to probably screen out for the future people who are prone to PTSD, as well as people who are probably trigger happy. You'd want to find that middle ground where they feel like they're doing their job and they get a reward from that, and they don't feel good about it, but they're also not going to, need medical assistance in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a really hard thing to screen for. Like, I mean, you're trying to screen for somebody that's going to have a problem doing something that they've never done before, and you're trying to screen for psychopaths, basically. So I think where the Air Force does a really good job is acknowledging that killing with an RPA is a high likelihood of the occupation, and that upfront, if anyone has any sort of reservations with that as part of their job, then they tend to move them in a different direction, rather than being in the service employing an armed RPA. So they might go to just a reconnaissance drone only, or they might move them into a different occupational field. So they do a pretty good job of screening up front.
Yeah. Well, now, speaking practically, is there a difference between a drone pilot pulling the trigger from thousands of miles away, right? Where I've seen the inside of the drone operating rooms. They're at a control panel. They've got a bunch of instrumentation and the view panels and all that stuff. Is there a difference between them pushing a button where they're at to fire a Hellfire missile compared to an A-10 pilot dropping bombs based on the same information from the drone?
Yeah, so practically speaking, there are differences and there are similarities. So the difference is obviously that the drone crews do not go into harm's way, right? So there's no fear for their own life, which is obviously a good thing, that we're putting less people in harm's way and still having a positive effect on the outcome of a conflict. So there's no fear of losing your own life. So obviously, I don't want to take anything away from what manned aviators do, right? They go into harm's way, even if they're employing missiles and bombs from beyond visual line of sight. there's still a possibility of being shot down or something malfunctioning, and it takes a lot of courage to fly a manned platform. So that's the main difference. There are a lot of similarities, though. In fact, there were several interviews I did of people that were removed from flying a manned platform and then put into an RPA to serve as a pilot to fly those kinds of missions. And almost to a person, every one of them said there wasn't a significant difference in the actual tactical action of striking a platform. It felt like they were there. They felt like they were almost in harm's way, or they felt like they were on the scene. And the results, the impact, what they saw as a result of conducting a strike was no different in their mind. In fact, in some ways, it's actually a little bit more intense, because manned platforms like jets have limited what we call time on station, right? They have limited fuel, limited time to conduct an action before they have to return back to base. Whereas drones can loiter for hours and hours on end. So it gives you the luxury of striking a target and then being able to stick around and observe the battle damage assessment afterwards and observe the impact of it. So that's another difference, but it's also a lot of that plays into some negative effects for the crews.
Yeah, well, and I was going to ask if the emotional distance, and it sounds like you've already kind of answered this, if the emotional distance of pulling a trigger remotely changes the operator's willingness or sense of responsibility compared to being in there, right? Your A-10 pilot, as you've said, they're in harm's way. They're also up close. They're there. They're in the moment. And in a drone, I'm wondering if that distance changes their willingness to do that role, or if it changes, I guess, any of the psychological factors that are really important to making that decision.
Yeah, so the physical distance is almost irrelevant. Once you get beyond visual line of sight and you're not in harm's way, it doesn't matter if you're 70 miles or 7,000 miles away from a target. But the emotional distance, or what I referred to in the book as the cognitive distance, is extremely close because of the persistence. And in fact, I equate it to being there almost face to face, because you're seeing very intimate and humanizing details of those targets. You're seeing hand gestures, and you're seeing people interact with their families, and you're seeing all these things that make you realize the humanity of the target. The sensors we're talking about are really great. I mean, they allow you to zoom in, see fine details from pretty far distance away. And the fact that you can loiter overhead for a really long period of time allows you to build that pattern of life and watch that person for a really long period of time. And in fact, some people that I interviewed were watching the same people over periods of months. They came in every day, they'd work an 8 to 10 hour shift, and they'd watch this individual target for months on end, just building their intelligence on the situation, and in some cases waiting for the right time to strike that target when it was free or clear of any sort of collateral damage concerns.
Well, yeah, and that was one of the things I wanted to ask about. One of the big issues in Iraq and Afghanistan that I heard about on the news were the claims by insurgents that our drones were targeting civilians based on faulty intelligence, right? Because that's not something we would ever do intentionally. But I think one of the problems has been, especially when it's an RPA, is we take out the target, but then in terms of collateral damage, the news media can say whatever it wants to say, and the insurgents will say whatever they want to say to deflect blame. So does the remote nature of these strikes make that intelligence harder to confirm or easier?
I think it makes it harder to confirm. Typically, RPAs are acting on at the request of someone else, like somebody that's on the ground that has identified a target and has requested them to come in, either look at that target or to actually strike that target. So they're always acting on behalf of somebody else. So that intelligence is coming from someone on the ground. Now that changes if you're trying to conduct over the horizon, operations, and if you think you can police a nation from the sky only through the intelligence that you gather through a soda straw view of the camera, it is significantly more challenging. You really need people on the ground to develop that human intelligence and understanding of the context of the situation in order to have a better picture of what the threat actually is.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a flip side to this also that's really important to point out, and that is using drones, using RPAs. This saves American lives and it saves American dollars. I mean, do you have any idea how many lives, how many soldiers, have they done estimates on how many of our side have been saved who haven't died because they haven't been in harm's way?
I haven't seen anything about that, but I mean, you can imagine, I think the Air Force flies close to 70 combat air patrols continuously around the globe, 24/7. So imagine if those were flown with a manned asset. And before we built up the capacity with RPAs, we were using manned platforms to conduct what we call non-traditional ISR, or intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, right? So we were using things like F-18s and Harriers and F-16s with their pods, with humans in the cockpit flying over targets for an hour at a time, trying to gather information. So the birth of drones came out of this need that we needed, a ton of platforms. We needed cameras and eyes in the sky, and we didn't have them. We were using manned aviation to do that, which burned up a lot of their useful time on those platforms. So their service life really ended before we had projected, which cost a ton of money to either buy new systems or to repair them. And the answer was, well, let's build up the capacity for drones to do this kinds of mission. It's the dull, dirty, dangerous niche where drones really excel.
Well, and with a human operator also, right? Like with the jet pilot, when they're up for the duration of the mission, as well as the flight prep and all of that kind of stuff. Whereas with the drone, you can swap out operators while it's in the air, right?
Yeah,
So,
you could potentially have 3 crews in one mission that fly the same drone, all from a remote distance.
yeah. So that I mean, everything that I've read seems to suggest that drones or some variant of it is where air power is going for so many different reasons, and not just fighter aircraft, but also probably logistics at some point. I mean, stuff where you've got human boredom, human endurance, anything along those lines. It's easier to do that remotely. It's more cost effective. It's safer, right? So
I think there are still missions where you want the human as close to the problem as possible, and maybe the ultimate solution is what we refer to as manned and unmanned teaming, where you have a bunch of unmanned wingmen that are being employed by a manned aviator to do some of those tasks that we're talking about. So I think there's absolutely still a need for manned aviation. It's probably possible these days to replace the majority of those things, those missions that they're doing with an unmanned system. But do we want to? I guess is one question. Like, if you're a casualty on the battlefield, do you want to get into a drone that's evacuating you out of the conflict area that's not flown by a pilot who's on board. I mean,
Well, and those are under development. There's actually a company in Finland, and they're making this for mountain climbers. So
yeah.
yeah. Well, you're touching on a really interesting point. I'd like to get a little bit more speculative. I'll probably get myself in trouble one way or the other on this one. But if you can follow along with me, and if I'm getting way too far out, just let me know. But the thing that interested me about this again is I see this direction going as this technology enables this, and there are some advantages to it. There are also the development of drone tanks. And this is, again, the success of aerial drones is leading various militaries for this. There's the MILREM MIS, the Ripsaw M5 Robotank, the Milos UGV, Gladiator TUGV, Foster Miller Talon, and many more. And these are all drone tanks they're all heavily armed, heavily armored, and they all currently require a human operator to pilot them remotely, right? So are you familiar with any of the transition of this into land-based vehicles?
Yeah, I'm familiar with the efforts to do so. And currently, as you mentioned, the majority of them are still remotely operated. So rather than having a person in harm's way, you have that person that's remote somewhere. They can control bulldozers in Australia remotely for some of those kinds of missions. They can. There was a story in the news, I believe it was a couple of weeks ago, about a system called the GNOM, pronounced GNOME, that was basically a ground robot that had a machine gun on it that was controlled by fiber optic cable remotely. It could go out to about, I believe it was 3 kilometers. That's actually being introduced into the fight in Ukraine. So those capabilities are here. They're coming.
Yes.
I think, as long as there's a human that is involved in the process, I think that's okay. But where we get on the slippery slope, which I think we'll touch on, is what happens when we remove the human from that decision-making process.
Well, and it's interesting that you mentioned them. I will look that one up. That must be new. But yeah, the notes that I have are a little bit old. The big one for me was Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Rogozin at the time described the robot platform Fedor, which is another humanoid robot showing shooting skills with 2 hands. And they actually had photos of it where Fedor had a pistol and it was, doing shooting and hitting targets. And then he quickly added, we're not creating a Terminator, but an AI that will be of great practical significance in various fields. So yeah, it's a humanoid robot with a gun, but it's not the Terminator. Now, in the other one is here in the US, we have the Boston Dynamics Atlas series, which has been, they're doing obstacle courses with that. You just mentioned the GNOME. So it looks like we're starting to see humanoid robots enter warfare as well. And again, these are drones, right? They're remotely piloted.
Yeah, I don't have too much information on humanoid robots that are being employed remotely. I think most of those, at least like Boston Dynamics, is focused on some commercial applications as opposed to
yeah. Well, and I should mention, I mean, there are significant limitations with power cells, right? Like lithium-ion batteries and things like that. So, we're not in any danger anytime soon, because these things, I mean, like you mentioned, they require a tether, they require a cable. These are not, free-ranging type things. But I guess you touched on the moral and ethical issues of AI decision making. And so this was another area where I did some research. Great Britain and the United States, and the USA, we just announced this, have both started funding research into drones that decide when to pull the trigger themselves. And there are 36 countries currently using armed drones. There was an analyst named Paul Scharr who said it's very likely that nations will invest in this if they haven't already. And my understanding is partly because of the time delay that's involved with the data links, right?
Yeah, that's correct. They're trying to build systems that can operate in an environment where communications and GPS and things like that are degraded or denied. So your remotely operated systems would basically be ineffective, and it would also be too risky in some situations to put manned platforms in there. So the way around that is through autonomy and artificial intelligence, combined with robotics. So you have these systems that can sense the environment, move on their own, determine threats, determine if that threat meets the rules of engagement and is a legitimate military target. And then once that decision has been made, it's either yes or no, right? It's kind of binary at that point. If it's a yes, then the employment of munitions to engage that target is the next logical step. So you have these autonomous systems that are making the determination without a human in the loop, if you will, to make that decision to engage an enemy target.
Yeah.
These systems don't exist on the battlefield yet, but I think that the capabilities are there through autonomous target recognition, things like that. I mean, the United States has said that we will always have a human somewhere in that decision-making cycle. We haven't determined where within that cycle the human actually is. Right? So I like to argue that I think that war is a human endeavor, and there must be a cost associated with conducting war, and that is at the point of where a human has to make the decision to actually kill another human, because there are so many novel incidents that I think we would miss through autonomous target recognition. Just hand gestures, things that we do as humans that other humans recognize that machines have a hard time identifying. All of those novel situations, I think, are where the context and human understanding, where you need that human judgment and appropriate human control.
Well, another aspect of it also, and this is, I don't have this experience, so I may be speaking out of turn, but my brother is a combat veteran, and him and many of the people who've been through that, their experiences haunt them. I guess it haunts veterans, as you may have experienced. It haunts veterans for many years, but in another sense, making those decisions, maybe that's something that's supposed to haunt us to some degree. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I think there needs to be a human cost to getting involved in a conflict. I mean, imagine if there was no risk to human loss of life, no risk to human psychological, physiological challenges. Does that make it easier for us to immediately go to the conflict button and say, yes, we're going to engage because the risk is so much less than it has been in the past, right? I mean, that's part of the calculus to go to war. It should be, is how much blood and treasure are we willing to sacrifice in order to achieve these objectives?
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. Now, do you think that would it be fair to say, I guess, that we're kind of falling down a slippery slope in terms of machine automation, and that we need to collectively make some decisions? I mean, and I think I fall down on the side of things that you do. People absolutely need to be involved in this, but the blood and treasure calculus, I think, is a part of that. Human warfare it's a human endeavor, and if we automate that too much, it seems like that could go some really, scary places, I guess.
Well, Tim, I like to use the analogy of self-driving cars for this, this kinds of debate, because self-driving cars right now are still in their infancy, right? They're very immature to to get to the path of being a fully autonomous self-driving car. But imagine if we got to the point where you could account for all of the novel situations that you would encounter on the road, and a self-driving car could navigate those successfully, 99.9% of the time, maybe more. And that would reduce the amount of accidents, reduce the amount of deaths we have on the highways. I think in 2020 alone, we had 38,000 people in the United States that died in a car accident.
Okay.
If you could reduce that number, down to near zero through autonomy, do we have a moral imperative to do so, to save lives? Because, I mean, you can imagine how many fatal accidents where the root cause is human error. It's probably pretty high. Right? I mean, human error is,
I think the majority of accidents are human err. Yeah.
Human error is usually the leading cause of aviation accidents, and it's probably close to the top, or close to 100% of vehicle accidents. Okay, so accidents that occur in conflict as well, fratricide, targeting the wrong person, making a poor decision on which target, underestimating collateral damage, all of those things. If we could automate a lot of that to where the process is significantly less risky to civilian casualties and fratricide and things like that, and we only kill the exact target that we're trying to kill, I come back to the same point. Do we have a moral imperative to take the human out of the loop to reduce suffering, in the risk of fratricide in the civilian casualties? I mean, I think that's the flip side of the autonomy of everything's going to be a Terminator. We tend to forget that autonomy, once it's fully mature, actually makes our life a lot better. So
that's an excellent point. That's something that futurist Ray Kurzweil has talked about as well. He said, we're usually scared of these things while they're emerging, and then once they're here, he's like, there's a point where it doesn't matter anymore, and that's the point where it's accepted. And what you're talking about sounds like that.
I believe he said, once it's mature and accepted, it's just software at that point, right?
Yeah.
No longer an emerging technology.
This is an interesting, again, Wayne, thank you so much for joining me today. For me, this is incredibly interesting because you can kind of see the road that things are going, and there are so many different paths that it could go down on that road, I guess. And your book, On Killing Remotely, and I will absolutely put links in for the audience. You're touching on this, and you're touching on the human cost. You're touching on what's important about this to us, I guess, as human beings and also as a species. So,
well, thanks, Tim. I really appreciate the insightful questions, and it's been a pleasure to talk with you today. Thank you.
Thank you again, sir.